The autumn of 1512 brought with it more than just falling leaves to the hills surrounding Florence. For Niccolò Machiavelli, it brought the collapse of everything he had built over 14 years of diplomatic service. The Medici had returned to power, the republic he had served was dissolved, and his political career lay in ruins. Stripped of his position, suspected of conspiracy, and tortured in prison, the man who had once walked the corridors of power now found himself broken and exiled to his small farm in Sant'Andrea. Yet it was from this very destruction that one of history's most profound insights would emerge. In the quiet solitude of his exile, Machiavelli would discover a fundamental truth about human nature and resilience. The man who destroys his weak self can never be destroyed by others. This principle, woven throughout his later writings but most powerfully demonstrated in his own life, reveals the secret architecture of authentic strength and the pathway to rising again when everything falls apart. The story of this transformation begins not with triumph, but with the complete annihilation of everything Machiavelli believed defined him. It is a story that speaks to every soul who has ever faced the wreckage of their carefully constructed life and wondered if recovery was possible. More than that, it is a blueprint for understanding that our greatest disasters often contain within them the seeds of our most profound resurrections. Part 1. The Anatomy of Collapse and the Hidden Architecture of Weakness. The morning mist clung to the Tuscan hills as Machiavelli made his way along the familiar path to his small estate. 6 months had passed since his imprisonment, and the physical wounds from the strapado had healed, but something deeper remained broken. He had spent his entire adult life believing that his identity was inseparable from his position, his influence, his ability to shape the political landscape of Florence. Now stripped of these external markers of success, he faced a question that would haunt him for months. Who was he when everything he thought he was had been taken away? This question lies at the heart of what Machiavelli would later recognize as the fundamental weakness that makes men vulnerable to complete destruction. Most people, he observed, build their sense of self like a house of cards, each card representing some external validation: their job, their reputation, their relationships, their possessions, their social status. They mistake these external supports for the foundation of their being, never realizing that anything built on such shifting ground is destined for collapse. The weak self, Machiavelli came to understand, is characterized by its dependence on circumstances beyond its control. It derives its sense of worth from the approval of others, its confidence from temporary successes, its identity from roles that can be stripped away at any moment. This weak self lives in constant fear because, at some unconscious level, it knows its own fragility. It knows that its entire sense of being rests on conditions that are ultimately impermanent. During those first months of exile, Machiavelli experienced what he would later describe as the great emptying. Everything that had given his life meaning seemed to have been drained away. His mornings, once filled with urgent diplomatic correspondence and political maneuvering, now stretched before him with nothing but the mundane tasks of managing a small farm. His evenings, once spent in the company of Florence's intellectual and political elite, were now passed in solitude or in conversation with local farmers and tradesmen whose concerns seemed infinitely removed from the grand affairs of state that had once consumed him. It was during this period of profound disorientation that Machiavelli began to observe something curious about his own psychological landscape. Beneath the obvious pain of his losses, beneath the wounded pride and the practical concerns about his future, he detected something else. A strange kind of relief. It was as if a tremendous weight he hadn't even realized he was carrying had been lifted from his shoulders. The constant vigilance required to maintain his position, the endless calculations about how his words and actions would be perceived, the exhausting effort of trying to control outcomes that were largely beyond his influence, all of this had disappeared. This observation led Machiavelli to one of his most profound insights. The weak self is not only vulnerable to external destruction, it is also a prison. The man who has built his identity around external validations becomes a slave to maintaining them. He cannot speak truthfully if truth threatens his image. He cannot act according to his genuine convictions if those convictions conflict with what others expect of him. He cannot pursue what he truly values if it risks the loss of what he thinks defines him. In trying to preserve a false self built on shifting foundations, he sacrifices his authentic self that no external force can touch. The weak self operates according to what Machiavelli termed the logic of accumulation. It believes that security comes from gathering more approval, more success, more control, more certainty. But this logic contains a fatal flaw that Machiavelli discovered through his own experience. The more the weak self accumulates, the more it has to lose. The more it depends on external conditions for its sense of worth, the more vulnerable it becomes to any change in those conditions. The man who defines himself by his wealth lives in terror of poverty. The man who defines himself by others' approval becomes a prisoner of their opinions. The man who defines himself by his achievements cannot bear the thought of failure. This vulnerability of the weak self extends beyond mere psychological discomfort. Machiavelli observed that men who have built their identity on external foundations become predictable and therefore manipulable. Their fears, their desires, their decision-making patterns all flow from their desperate need to preserve what they think they are. An enemy who understands these dependencies can exploit them ruthlessly. The man who cannot bear to lose his reputation can be controlled through threats to his image. The man who cannot imagine life without his current position will sacrifice his principles to keep it. The man who has never learned to distinguish between what he has and who he is remains forever at the mercy of circumstances. But Machiavelli's most unsettling discovery was that the weak self doesn't merely make us vulnerable to external attacks. It actively collaborates in its own destruction. Because it is built on false foundations, the weak self is inherently unstable. It requires constant maintenance, constant vigilance, constant energy to prop up. Over time, this effort becomes unsustainable. The man who lives according to others' expectations eventually loses touch with his own authentic desires and judgments. The man who defines himself by his achievements finds that no achievement is ever enough to provide lasting satisfaction. The man who builds his sense of worth on external validation discovers that the approval of others is like trying to fill a bucket with a hole in the bottom. No amount is ever sufficient to create genuine fullness. This internal instability of the weak self creates what Machiavelli called the conditions for self-destruction. Even in the absence of external enemies, the weak self tends toward collapse because it is fundamentally unsustainable. It demands more energy than it provides, creates more anxiety than it relieves, and promises more security than it can deliver. Men who have never faced external catastrophes sometimes experience mysterious depressions, inexplicable anxieties, or sudden crises of meaning, precisely because their weak selves have finally exhausted their capacity to maintain the illusion of stability. The recognition of these patterns in his own life led Machiavelli to a startling conclusion. His political downfall, devastating as it had seemed, might actually have been a kind of liberation. The external forces that had stripped away his false identity had inadvertently freed him from a prison he hadn't even realized he was in. The question was whether he could learn to see this destruction not as a catastrophe to be recovered from, but as an opportunity to build something more authentic and ultimately more resilient. This shift in perspective marked the beginning of what Machiavelli would later recognize as the most important work of his life. Not the recovery of his former position, but the construction of a new self that could never be destroyed by external circumstances because it did not depend on them for its existence. It was the beginning of his understanding that true strength comes not from accumulating more of what can be taken away, but from discovering what cannot be touched by any external force. As winter settled over the Tuscan countryside, Machiavelli began to glimpse the outline of a profound truth. The man who could learn to systematically destroy his own weak self would discover within himself something indestructible. This destruction, however, would require a different kind of courage than he had ever needed in his political career. It would require the willingness to let go of everything he thought he needed to be secure, to question every assumption about what made life worth living, and to face the terrifying possibility that everything he had previously considered valuable might be nothing more than elaborate distractions from what truly mattered. The path forward would demand that he learn to distinguish between what could be taken from him and what was inherently his own. It would require him to discover sources of strength that existed independently of external validation. Most challenging of all, it would require him to find meaning and purpose that could survive any conceivable loss. The man who could accomplish this transformation would emerge not just recovered from his disasters, but fundamentally immune to the kind of complete destruction he had just experienced. But first he would have to learn the art of systematic self-destruction, not the chaotic destruction that life had imposed upon him, but the careful, conscious dismantling of every false support his weak self had been using. Only by destroying what was false could he discover what was genuinely indestructible within himself. Part 2. The conscious destruction of false foundations. The snow had begun to fall in earnest by December of 1512, blanketing Machiavelli's modest estate in a silence that seemed to mirror the stillness that had descended upon his life. It was during these long winter evenings, with nothing but flickering candlelight and the distant sound of wind through bare branches, that he began what he would later describe as the great work of undoing. If external forces had already destroyed so much of what he had believed himself to be, perhaps it was time to complete the process consciously and systematically. The idea came to him gradually, emerging from his observation that the pain of his losses was not uniform. Some aspects of his former life, when he imagined them gone forever, filled him with genuine grief. Others, when he examined them honestly, brought only a kind of tired relief. This distinction intrigued him. What if the aspects that brought relief were precisely those elements of his weak self that had been draining his energy and authentic power? What if the pain he felt was not for the loss of something valuable, but for his attachment to things that had never truly served him? This insight led Machiavelli to devise what he came to think of as the practice of conscious questioning. Every morning as he went about the simple tasks of his rural exile, he would choose one aspect of his former identity and subject it to ruthless examination. He would ask himself, did this thing I thought I needed actually make me stronger or weaker? Did it increase my genuine autonomy or make me more dependent on factors beyond my control? Did it connect me more deeply to what I truly valued, or did it distract me from what mattered most? The first target of this systematic inquiry was his attachment to others' opinions of his intelligence and political acumen. For 14 years, Machiavelli had carefully cultivated a reputation as one of Florence's most insightful political minds. He had crafted his words and diplomatic correspondence not just to achieve practical objectives, but to demonstrate his sophistication and cleverness. He had taken pride in being consulted by important figures, in having his analysis sought and respected. Now, in exile, with no audience for his insights and no platform for his expertise, he was forced to confront how much of his intellectual activity had been driven not by genuine curiosity or the desire for truth, but by the need to maintain his image as someone worth listening to. The process of letting go of this attachment proved more difficult than he had anticipated. When he read works of history or political philosophy in his study, he caught himself formulating brilliant observations that no one would ever hear. When he analyzed current political developments, he found himself imagining how impressed others would be by his insights. The habit of thinking for an audience had become so ingrained that he struggled to think purely for his own understanding and development. But as he persisted in questioning this pattern, something remarkable began to emerge. When he stopped trying to have impressive thoughts and simply allowed himself to think clearly about whatever genuinely interested him, his thinking became more original, more penetrating, more alive. Without the need to conform to others' expectations about what constituted sophisticated analysis, he found himself pursuing lines of inquiry that were genuinely novel. Without the pressure to reach conclusions that would enhance his reputation, he could afford to sit with uncertainty, to explore uncomfortable questions, to change his mind when evidence warranted it. This experience taught Machiavelli a crucial lesson about the nature of authentic strength. Genuine power comes not from impressing others with what you know, but from the willingness to discover what you don't know. The man who thinks primarily to maintain his reputation as intelligent becomes stupid because he cannot afford to be wrong about anything. The man who thinks purely for the sake of understanding becomes genuinely intelligent because he is free to learn from every mistake, every surprise, every challenge to his preconceptions. The second major attachment he examined was his need for control over outcomes. Throughout his political career, Machiavelli had prided himself on his ability to anticipate consequences, to craft strategies that would achieve desired results, to influence events through careful planning and shrewd maneuvering. His sense of professional competence had been largely built around his capacity to make things happen in the political realm. Now, having experienced the complete failure of his ability to control the most important outcome of all, the preservation of his own position in the Republican government he had served, he was forced to confront the illusory nature of most human control. This examination proved particularly painful because it struck at something Machiavelli had considered central to his identity as a man. In the culture of Renaissance Italy, masculine worth was largely measured by one's ability to impose one's will upon circumstances, to shape events according to one's desires, to be a man of consequence in the world. The admission that most of what he had thought was under his control had actually been subject to forces far beyond his influence felt like an admission of fundamental inadequacy. But as he worked through this attachment, Machiavelli began to discover a paradox that would become central to his mature philosophy. The man who accepts the inherent uncertainty and uncontrollability of most outcomes becomes far more effective at influencing the things that actually are within his control. When he stopped wasting energy trying to control what was uncontrollable, he had more energy available for the things that he could genuinely influence. When he stopped basing his sense of worth on outcomes that depended on countless factors beyond his reach, he could make decisions based on what he genuinely believed was right and effective, rather than on what he hoped would produce specific results. This shift revealed to Machiavelli what he would later recognize as one of the most important distinctions for anyone seeking to build authentic strength: the difference between control and influence. Control implies the ability to determine outcomes with certainty. Influence involves the capacity to improve the probability of desired outcomes, while accepting that certainty is rarely achievable. The man who demands control becomes paralyzed when he encounters situations that cannot be controlled. The man who accepts the limits of control but maximizes his influence within those limits becomes extraordinarily powerful precisely because he is not attached to specific outcomes. The third attachment Machiavelli subjected to systematic questioning was perhaps the most fundamental: his belief that his worth as a human being was tied to his achievements and social position. This belief had driven him to work tirelessly for advancement in the Florentine government, to seek recognition for his diplomatic successes, to measure his life's value by the external markers of worldly success. The loss of his position had therefore felt like the loss of his very reason for existing. Examining this attachment required Machiavelli to ask himself uncomfortable questions about the nature of human worth. If his value as a person really did depend on his achievements, what did that say about people who had achieved less than he had? If social position determined human worth, were the farmers and craftsmen he now spent his days with inherently less valuable than the political elites he had once moved among? If external recognition was necessary for a meaningful life, what about all the good and significant things that people did that no one ever noticed or applauded? The more deeply he investigated these questions, the more clearly Machiavelli saw the arbitrary and ultimately meaningless nature of most social hierarchies. He began to recognize that his former position had given him certain opportunities and responsibilities, but it had not made him more valuable as a human being. His diplomatic successes had solved certain problems and advanced certain interests, but they had not increased his fundamental worth. His reputation among Florence's elite had opened certain doors and created certain possibilities, but it had not made him more deserving of happiness or fulfillment. This recognition initially brought Machiavelli face to face with what seemed like a terrifying void. If his worth was not determined by his achievements, position, or recognition, then what was it determined by? If these external markers of success were not what made life meaningful, then what did? For several weeks, he found himself in a state of profound disorientation, as if the compass he had been using to navigate his life had suddenly been revealed as fundamentally unreliable. But gradually, as he sat with this uncertainty rather than trying to resolve it quickly, something new began to emerge. He noticed that there were moments in his daily life that felt meaningful and valuable, even though they contributed nothing to any external measure of success. The satisfaction he felt when he successfully repaired something on his property. The pleasure he took in a well-crafted sentence in a letter to a friend. The sense of connection he experienced during conversations with his neighbors about their concerns and challenges. The deep peace that settled over him during his evening walks through the countryside. These experiences shared a common characteristic. They were valuable in themselves, not because they led to something else or because others approved of them. They arose from his direct engagement with reality, from the exercise of his genuine capacities, from his authentic connections with people and places and ideas he cared about. They required nothing external to validate them because their value was inherent, not dependent. This discovery led Machiavelli to what he would later consider his most important insight about the indestructible self. Authentic worth cannot be given or taken away by external circumstances because it does not depend on them. It arises from the fact of being a conscious being capable of understanding, creating, connecting, and choosing. These capacities exist independently of any particular role, position, achievement, or recognition. They can be developed and expressed in countless different ways, but they cannot be destroyed by any external force. The man who recognizes this inherent worth in himself becomes immune to the kind of complete destruction that Machiavelli had experienced. He may lose his job, his reputation, his wealth, his social position, all the external supports that the weak self depends upon, but he cannot lose what makes him fundamentally valuable. More than that, he discovers that these external things, while sometimes useful and enjoyable, are not necessary for a meaningful and fulfilling life. As winter gave way to spring in 1513, Machiavelli found himself in a remarkably different psychological state than he had been in just a few months earlier. The systematic questioning of his false attachments had not eliminated his interest in worldly success or his desire to contribute to public life, but it had freed him from the desperate need for these things that had once made him vulnerable to complete devastation. He still hoped to return to political service, but this hope no longer felt like a matter of life and death. He still cared about his reputation, but he no longer needed others' approval to maintain his sense of worth. Most importantly, he had discovered that the process of conscious self-destruction was not a one-time event, but an ongoing practice. The weak self, he realized, was constantly trying to rebuild itself around new attachments and dependencies. The man who wanted to remain strong would need to continue examining and releasing these false supports throughout his life. He would need to maintain the discipline of distinguishing between what enhanced his authentic power and what merely fed his ego's need for validation. This ongoing practice of conscious self-destruction required what Machiavelli came to think of as the courage of emptiness. It meant being willing to let go of securities that felt real and important, even when he couldn't immediately see what would replace them. It meant choosing uncertainty over false certainty, authentic struggle over comfortable illusion, genuine growth over the maintenance of familiar patterns. But the reward for this courage was beginning to become clear. The man who could systematically destroy his weak self would discover, beneath all the false supports and dependencies, something that no external force could touch, an essential core of being that was inherently complete, inherently valuable, inherently free. The discovery and development of this indestructible self would require everything he had learned about letting go of false attachments, but it would also demand new skills and new understanding. It would require him to learn not just what to destroy, but what to build in place of what he had destroyed. Part 3. The emergence of the indestructible self. By the summer of 1513, something profound had shifted in the rhythm of Machiavelli's days. The morning sun that streamed through the windows of his study no longer illuminated a man desperately trying to recover what he had lost, but one who was discovering what could never be taken away. The systematic destruction of his false attachments had cleared space for something new to emerge, not a return to his former self, but the birth of what he would come to recognize as his authentic nature. This emergence began with a simple but revolutionary change in how he approached his daily activities. Instead of viewing his exile as a temporary interruption of his real life, Machiavelli began to see it as life itself. Instead of waiting for circumstances to change so that he could resume being who he thought he was supposed to be, he began asking a different question. Who could he become right here, right now, with exactly the resources and constraints that were present? This shift from waiting for life to happen to actively creating life within whatever circumstances existed marked the beginning of what Machiavelli would later understand as the fundamental characteristic of the indestructible self: its independence from external conditions, for its sense of purpose and fulfillment. The weak self always needs something to change before it can be happy, successful, or complete. The indestructible self finds ways to be fully engaged and creative within whatever reality it faces. The first manifestation of this new approach appeared in Machiavelli's relationship to his intellectual work. For months after his exile, he had felt frustrated by his inability to engage with the great political questions of his time in any meaningful way. Cut off from access to current information, lacking an audience for his insights, stripped of any official capacity to influence events, he had experienced his analytical gifts as useless burdens. But now he began to approach these same gifts from a completely different angle. Instead of trying to analyze current events for their immediate practical implications, Machiavelli began studying the deeper patterns that connected political developments across different times and places. Instead of crafting observations designed to impress powerful audiences, he began writing purely to understand the principles that governed human behavior in political contexts. Instead of seeking to influence specific outcomes, he began exploring the timeless questions about power, leadership, human nature, and social organization that fascinated him for their own sake. This shift in approach led to what would become The Prince, but its significance for Machiavelli's personal transformation was even greater than its eventual impact on political thought. In writing purely for the sake of understanding rather than for immediate practical application, he discovered that his mind was capable of insights far more original and penetrating than anything he had produced while trying to serve specific political purposes. When he stopped trying to be useful in the ways others expected, he became useful in ways that would endure for centuries. This experience taught Machiavelli a crucial lesson about the nature of authentic contribution. The man who develops his genuine gifts without regard for immediate external validation often creates work of far greater lasting value than the man who carefully crafts everything to meet current expectations. The indestructible self contributes to the world not by trying to give people what they think they want, but by developing and expressing what is most authentic and valuable within itself. The second major characteristic of the emerging indestructible self was its relationship to uncertainty and change. The weak self lived in constant anxiety about the future, because its sense of security depended on maintaining familiar conditions. Machiavelli's exile had forced him to confront the reality that no external conditions are permanent, that change is the only constant, that the universe is far too complex and dynamic for any human being to predict or control with certainty. Initially, this recognition had been terrifying, but as he learned to live with radical uncertainty as a permanent condition rather than a temporary problem to be solved, Machiavelli discovered that uncertainty could be a source of freedom rather than anxiety. If nothing was permanently fixed, then no disaster was permanently decisive. If all conditions were subject to change, then any situation contained possibilities that were not immediately apparent. If the future was genuinely unpredictable, then hope was always reasonable, regardless of how dire present circumstances appeared. This comfort with uncertainty gave the indestructible self a tremendous advantage in navigating challenges. Where the weak self wasted enormous energy trying to achieve impossible certainty, the indestructible self could invest all its energy in responding creatively to whatever actually emerged. Where the weak self became paralyzed by unexpected developments, the indestructible self remained flexible and adaptive. Where the weak self saw change as a threat to its security, the indestructible self saw change as an opportunity for growth and new possibilities. Machiavelli began to notice this shift most clearly in his emotional responses to news from Florence. Word would reach him of new political developments, changes in leadership, shifts in policy, and he would observe his own reactions carefully. The weak self that had defined itself by its position in the Florentine government would have experienced each development as either a threat to or opportunity for its eventual restoration. But increasingly, Machiavelli found himself responding to these developments with genuine curiosity and interest, but without the desperate attachment to specific outcomes that had once characterized his political thinking. This emotional freedom from specific outcomes did not make him indifferent to the welfare of Florence or to his own prospects for future service. Rather, it allowed him to think more clearly about both because his judgment was not clouded by desperate need. When he was not attached to particular results, he could see situations more objectively and respond to them more effectively. When his sense of worth did not depend on specific developments, he could wish for good outcomes without being devastated by disappointing ones. The third crucial characteristic of the indestructible self was its capacity for what Machiavelli came to call authentic relationship. The weak self approached other people primarily as sources of validation, competition, or threat. Its interactions were largely strategic, designed to secure approval, maintain advantage, or defend against attack. Even its apparent generosity and concern for others were often motivated by the need to maintain a positive self-image, or to create obligations that could be called upon later. In exile, stripped of his former social position, and surrounded by people who had no particular interest in his former achievements, Machiavelli was forced to relate to others in entirely different ways. The farmers and craftsmen who are now his neighbors cared nothing for his diplomatic career or political insights. They judged him, to the extent they judged him at all, on his behavior toward them in the present moment. Was he helpful when they needed assistance? Did he treat them with respect? Could they trust his word in small matters? Was he pleasant company during shared work or casual conversation? Initially, these interactions felt almost surreal to Machiavelli. After years of carefully calculated social exchanges designed to advance complex political objectives, the simple directness of his neighbor's approach to human relationships seemed almost primitive. But gradually he began to appreciate the profound relief of relating to people without hidden agendas, strategic calculations, or the need to maintain carefully crafted impressions. In these simpler relationships, Machiavelli discovered aspects of himself that had been dormant for years. His natural curiosity about other people's experiences and perspectives, his genuine appreciation for craftsmanship and practical skill, his capacity for easy humor and straightforward communication, all of these had been suppressed or distorted by the demands of political life. Now they began to emerge naturally and spontaneously. More importantly, he discovered that relationships based on authentic interest in others rather than strategic need were far more nourishing and sustainable than the complex social networks he had once cultivated. When he helped a neighbor repair a fence, the satisfaction came not from the potential future advantage this might create, but from the immediate pleasure of useful work and friendly cooperation. When he shared a meal and conversation with local families, the enjoyment came not from information gathered or impressions managed, but from genuine human connection. This experience taught Machiavelli that the indestructible self related to others, not as objects to be manipulated or as sources of validation to be courted, but as fellow conscious beings worthy of interest and respect in their own right. This approach to relationship was not only more ethical but also more practical in the deepest sense. It created connections based on reality rather than illusion and therefore proved more reliable and satisfying over time. The fourth major characteristic of the emerging indestructible self was its relationship to meaning and purpose. The weak self derived its sense of meaning from external sources, the importance of its role, the significance of its achievements, the approval of others, the advancement of its status. When these external sources of meaning were removed, the weak self experienced existential crisis because it had no internal resources for creating meaning. Machiavelli's exile had stripped away all the external sources of meaning that had previously structured his sense of purpose. He was no longer serving the Florentine Republic, no longer playing a role in significant political events, no longer contributing to great public causes in any visible way. For months, this loss of external purpose had left him feeling adrift and directionless. But as he developed the practice of conscious self-destruction and began to discover his indestructible core, a new source of meaning began to emerge. This meaning came not from what he was accomplishing in the world's eyes, but from how fully he was developing and expressing his authentic nature. The disciplined study that led to his political writings felt meaningful not because it might restore his career, but because it engaged his deepest intellectual capacities in pursuit of genuine understanding. His simple daily interactions with neighbors felt significant not because they advanced any grand agenda, but because they expressed his natural capacity for connection and mutual aid. This shift revealed to Machiavelli that the indestructible self creates meaning through the quality of its engagement with reality rather than through the magnitude of its achievements. A conversation approached with full attention and genuine interest becomes meaningful regardless of the status of the participants or the apparent importance of the topic. Work done with skill and care becomes fulfilling regardless of whether anyone notices or applauds. Learning pursued for its own sake becomes valuable regardless of whether it leads to practical applications or professional advancement. The man who discovers this internal source of meaning becomes immune to the kind of existential devastation that accompanies external losses. He may be disappointed when projects fail or when opportunities disappear, but he does not lose his fundamental sense of purpose because that purpose is not dependent on external validation or excess. He finds ways to live meaningfully within whatever circumstances exist because meaning comes from how he approaches those circumstances rather than from the circumstances themselves. As 1513 drew to a close, Machiavelli recognized that something unprecedented had occurred in his life. The external destruction that had seemed like complete catastrophe had become the catalyst for the discovery of internal resources he had never known he possessed. The systematic destruction of his weak attachments had revealed a core self that was not only indestructible but far more capable and resilient than the identity he had lost. This indestructible self was characterized by its independence from external validation, its comfort with uncertainty, its capacity for authentic relationship, and its ability to create meaning through the quality of its engagement with reality. But perhaps most importantly, it was characterized by what Machiavelli came to think of as essential freedom. The recognition that regardless of what external constraints or opportunities existed, he always retained the fundamental human capacity to choose his response to circumstances. This freedom was not the ability to control outcomes or to make circumstances conform to his desires. It was something far more profound. The recognition that no external force could compel him to betray his authentic nature, abandon his genuine values, or surrender his commitment to truth and excellence. He might be prevented from acting in certain ways or achieving certain goals, but nothing could force him to act against his deepest convictions or to become someone other than who he authentically was. The man who recognizes this essential freedom discovers that he possesses a kind of power that cannot be given or taken away by any external authority. It is the power to remain true to himself regardless of consequences, to continue developing his authentic capacities regardless of circumstances, to maintain his commitment to what he values most deeply, regardless of whether that commitment is rewarded or punished by the world. This power makes the indestructible self truly indestructible, because it does not depend on any external conditions for its existence or expression. The man who possesses it may lose his wealth, his position, his reputation, even his life, but he cannot be destroyed in any fundamental sense, because what is most essential about him exists independently of all these external things. Machiavelli's final insight about the indestructible self was that its emergence did not represent the end of a process, but the beginning of a new way of living. The practices that had allowed him to destroy his weak attachments and discover his authentic core would need to continue throughout his life. The indestructible self was not a fixed achievement, but a dynamic way of being that required constant cultivation and renewal. The man who had learned to destroy his weak self would need to remain vigilant against its tendency to rebuild itself around new attachments and dependencies. He would need to continue distinguishing between what enhanced his authentic power and what merely fed his ego's need for validation. He would need to keep choosing uncertainty over false security, authentic engagement over comfortable routine, genuine growth over the maintenance of familiar patterns. But the reward for this ongoing commitment to authentic development was nothing less than genuine invincibility, not the impossible invulnerability to all loss and change, but the practical invincibility that comes from being rooted in what cannot be destroyed. The man who builds his life on this indestructible foundation may face the same external challenges and disappointments as everyone else, but he faces them from a position of fundamental strength that no external force can compromise. When everything falls apart, this is how you rise again. Not by rebuilding what was destroyed, but by discovering what can never be destroyed. Not by recovering what you lost, but by finding what was always yours. Not by returning to who you used to be, but by becoming who you were always meant to be. The man who learns this lesson transforms every disaster into an opportunity, every loss into a liberation, every ending into a new beginning. He becomes truly unconquerable because he has learned the secret that no enemy can ever discover. The fortress of the indestructible self cannot be attacked because it cannot be found by those who do not possess it within themselves. The lessons embedded in Machiavelli's transformation from political exile to timeless philosopher reveal a path available to anyone willing to undertake the difficult work of conscious self-destruction and authentic self-discovery. In every life that seems to have fallen apart completely, the same opportunity exists. To discover beneath the wreckage of false identities and external dependencies something that was never dependent on circumstances for its existence. The man who finds this indestructible core within himself joins the ranks of those who cannot be defeated, because they have learned to defeat themselves, not through self-harm or self-hatred, but through the careful destruction of everything false in service of everything true. This is the ultimate victory, the triumph not over others, but over the weak self that makes all other victories temporary and all other defeats devastating. The man who achieves this victory discovers that he has become unconquerable, not because he cannot lose, but because he has nothing left to lose that he was not willing to give away freely.